Welcome back to the second installment of my video series on the genetics of Tourette's that I'm making for PATSA. And in the first video I made that we posted on Saturday, I had an interview with Dr. Hyman, and we were talking about the genetic basis of Tourette's syndrome. And he told us about a term known as recurrence risk, which is a good way to think about how likely it is, given a person has Tourette's, that one of their offsprings might have Tourette's, and it's closely related to heritability. It's a common term used by genetic counselors, and one of the things that Dr. Hyman really emphasized in conversations I had with him throughout the interview and after is that these are really concepts and numbers that are based on large data sets, so many different families. So the number 29.9% in terms of recurrence risk should be taken with a grain of salt. So does this mean that your offspring, or you yourself, if you have Tourette's, if your kid has Tourette's, is it really going to be 30% that one of your kids has Tourette's or a tic disorder? That's a little bit more difficult. It's hard to extrapolate 100% from this large population data to specific families. So again, it's a guide, but you shouldn't take it too seriously. And if you really want to know more about that, I would probably recommend that you talk to a genetic counselor who can give you more information. So in today's video, what I wanted to do is actually talk about kind of a continuation of the first video and talk about two specific topics. One was tic severity. So to what extent does the fact that I have a very strong, tics that are very strong, how likely is it that my offspring, given the recurrence risk, but if they have tic or tic disorder, how likely is it to be as strong as mine? As you'll see, it turns out that it's very hard to predict from one generation to the next. Then the second topic is going to be about comorbidities, and specifically focusing on OCD and ADHD. And as you'll see, it's interesting that there's a very strong genetic relationship between Tourette's and OCD, but I was a little bit surprised. There seems to be much less of a link between ADHD and Tourette's. So let's now continue our interview with Dr. Hyman, and the first question I'll ask him is about tic severity.
I also want to mention in that 29% is that the severity changes over time. Is one thing that I think most of the families could relate to, is that tics change by the hour, by the day, by the week, by the month, by the season, by the year. They change in severity, they change in different parts of the body. So one thing you could say is that it's variable, okay? But in one person, their worst ever severity, which typically is in middle school, typically when you don't want to be showing off your looking different, is the worst ever severity is different for different people. So even within the same family, somebody might have mild, very mild, just a extra blinking, and somebody else in the family could have very severe tics. That's we don't know who's going to be severe and who's going to have mild. As a matter of fact, there's no good evidence that somebody who has very severe tics in childhood is going to have tics into adulthood. We don't know that. So we can't predict really well on who's going to continue to have tics into adulthood. So that's important to know that 29% is, yes, you might have very mild tics. We have plenty of families where, you know, let's say the father has just a little blinking and an extra blinking and never thought it was an issue, but their child has very severe tics. And then when we're evaluating the family, we see that the father also has tics, but they never bothered them. So It's really important that number, 29%, includes those people as well.
I see. Okay. And then another follow-up question, because some parents might be interested in this. You might have your son who has Tourette's, but your son might have brothers. What's the likelihood that a brother might have an offspring that has Tourette's. I'm assuming that that number goes down, but it doesn't go down to
Yes,
zero.
right. So that wouldn't be a first degree relative, that'd be a second degree relative. And the risks are increased over the general population, but it's like, I forgot, it's like 4 to 9% or something like that. Not that, not that high number that I was talking about before, but there's a chance. Genetics, there's a misconception that genetics sometimes skips a generation. That it doesn't happen. Person has this gene, but for some reason doesn't show the symptoms. That could be some other genes that might be interacting with it. It might be some environmental aspects.
Many of us, I'm sure, have wondered, where is the Tourette's coming from in our child? Because we look at ourselves, we look at our spouse, we look at our close relatives, and we don't see it. So I asked Dr. Hyman this question. Slightly long-winded, but his answer is really interesting. One question that I always find myself having is, I have a daughter who had Tourette's, and I'm a scientist, so I'm looking at her, and I look at my family, and I don't see anybody that has any Tourette symptoms. And so I'm sure a lot of parents find themselves in a similar situation. But then, as we just discussed a few minutes ago, there are lots of so-called comorbidities. In other words, diseases that occur together with Tourette's, such as obsessive compulsive disorder, such as ADHD, and probably a number of others.
Yes.
And then one thing I bet a lot of parents have realized this, as I have. You start looking at yourself, you start looking at your spouse, you start looking at your family members, and you go like, I see a little bit of OCD in maybe my sister-in-law, or I see some OCD in my mom. Or in fact, you have a conversation with your wife and you say, this happened to me. I don't know where the ADHD came from. I clearly don't have ADHD. And then your wife looks at you and say, honey, I think you do have ADHD. And obviously with all these different symptoms, it's always on a spectrum. So some people have OCD that's so strong that it really, they're not able to do anything. And other people can function perfectly well, and you never know they have OCD, except when they're maybe under duress or something with anxiety. Right. So I think.
So you want to know give me what this is all about?
Well, right? What I want to know is that, to what extent having some background of ADHD and OCD might actually contribute to an offspring having Tourette's, or do they have Tourette's because they have a mutation in a new gene and it's just a brand new thing in the family? I guess that's my question. So why is it that you as an individual with Tourette's might look around and not see anybody in your close or extended family who shows any signs of Tourette's? Dr. Hyman tells me we can think about this in two different ways. The first way is that possibly you as the individual might actually be the first in your family to actually have a mutation in the gene that causes susceptibility for Tourette's. Neither your mother or your father had a mutation in that gene. So that's one reason why you might actually truly be the first in your family to show symptoms of Tourette's or even other tic disorder. And that seems to occur in about 10% of the population of people who have Tourette's. The other way to think about it is that for the remaining 90% of individuals with Tourette's, they might actually look around and not see anybody in their proximate or extended family who shows signs of Tourette's. One possibility is that maybe your father or your uncle had a very mild tic disorder and nobody ever knew about it. So that's something that's not obvious. Now as you probe a little bit further, you go, oh, actually someone in my family did have that. The other possibility is that many of the genes, and we'll talk a lot more about what causes these mutations and why are there so many. Again, this is a very complicated genetic disorder. One other possibility is that there are other disorders such as OCD, maybe ADHD, that are genetically linked to Tourette's. And so you look around and you don't see anybody with Tourette's. But in fact, if you look carefully, you do actually see members of your extended family that do exhibit OCD. And as Dr. Hyman will talk to us in the next segment of my interview, is that there is a strong genetic relationship between OCD and Tourette's. In other words, an individual that has a mutation in one of those many genes could exhibit symptoms of OCD, and that could transmit in ways we don't fully understand yet to the next generation as Tourette's syndrome, possibly also with OCD. The linkage between ADHD, another comorbid disorder, and Tourette's seems to be less strong, as Dr. Hyman will describe for us.
So ADHD is, in the studies that have been done, the results are mixed to know if that might be part of the genetic component of the same genetic component. The studies are mixed in that. However, an OCD or obsessive compulsive symptoms or disorder, it seems very much like they are biologically related, both in those studies looking at the family studies. So for example, if I was working in an OCD study, nothing to do with tics, and I took a bunch of people with OCD and a bunch of people without OCD and looked at the rates in those relatives to see what tic disorders are, people with OCD is going to have a higher rate of tic disorders in the relatives compared to controls.
Interesting.
And the same would happen for the twin studies, which I'm not going to go into the details of, but basically, again, if one twin has OCD, the chance that the other twin might have a tic disorder is higher in the identical twins than in the non-identical twins. So there's some really strong biological relationship in between tic disorders and OCD.
That was a lot of information from Dr. Hyman, both in this video and the previous one. So why don't we try to recap the main points that he made. One of the first big points is that there clearly is a strong genetic component to Tourette's syndrome. And these come from both familial studies where we look at family pedigrees as well as twin studies. And it's also quite clear that genetically, Tourette's syndrome, as well as what would be considered chronic tic disorders, are actually genetically linked. And so from a genetic perspective, we cannot really think of them as separate disorders. The second point is that Dr. Hyman came up with this slightly different way of thinking about inheritance. And we're not talking about heritability, which is a slightly complicated term, but rather he's introducing a new term known as recurrence risk. And that is basically the likelihood that you, as a person who has either chronic tic disorder or Tourette's, what is the chance that one of your offspring will also have a chronic tic disorder or Tourette's? And the number that he came up with from all of his studies, looking at thousands of families, is 29%. And as he emphasized, this is only an average number. And if you have a boy, the recurrence risk is slightly higher, around 34%. And if you have a daughter, then the recurrence risk is lower, around 24%. The third point that really needs to be emphasized is that tic severity does not seem to be linked in a clear fashion to the genetics. So from many family studies, it seems as though if you are a young man who has quite severe symptoms, you are no more likely of having a child with severe symptoms as someone who has very mild symptoms. So again, tic severity does not seem to be consistently predictable from one generation to the next. The fourth point is that the genetics of Tourette are extremely complicated, and we will talk a lot more about the basis for that in the next video series. But the way we can think about it is that approximately 90% of cases are caused by damaging variants of genes that already exist in the family. The remaining 10% are caused by new mutations. So that means that the individual who has that mutation might be the first in his family or her family to actually show symptoms of Tourette's or chronic tic disorder. It has been estimated that damaging variants to up to several hundred genes can confer risk for Tourette's. The last point we want to make is that Tourette's seems to be genetically linked to some of the comorbidities, especially when we talk about obsessive compulsive disorder. So if you have OCD in the family, the likelihood that one of your children might have Tourette's is greater than chance. Likewise, if you have Tourette's, the likelihood that one of your offsprings will have OCD is greater than chance. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you found it informative. And in our next video, we'll dig deeper into the biology of the genetics and explore in more detail what we mean when we talk about gene mutations. Are genes destroyed, or are they just slightly modified? Is it something that happens to everybody, or is it just in some people? How do these small mutations in one or more genes contribute to the risk of having a chronic tic disorder? So we'll talk a little bit more about this. It'll be really kind of a little tutorial in biology, but I think you'll find it interesting. And if you're feeling generous, please consider making a small donation to the Pennsylvania Tourettes Syndrome Alliance, also known as PATSA. Like many of the local organizations in your community, if you're not from Pennsylvania, PATSA is so good at providing the support that kids need who have Tourette's, and they're really the boots on the ground, helping educate parents and especially teachers in the schools to create a nurturing and supportive environment for these kids, and really help them move forward. So please consider contributing. Thank you so much, and see you in the next video.